Theory of demand. The purpose of the theory of demand is to determine the various factors that affect demand. One often reads the reason day 3 of the theory of demand is to establishment of the law of demand, that the market demand is negatively related to the price. But this is misleading in that it concentrates on price as the sole determinant of demand, ceteris paribus. Demand is a multivariate relationship, that is, it is determined by many factors simultaneously. Some of the most important determinants of the market demand for a particular product are its own price, consumers' income, prices of other commodities, consumer tastes, income distribution, total population, consumers' wealth, credit availability, government's policy, past levels of demand and past levels of income. The traditional theory of demand has concentrated on 4 of the above determinants: the price of the commodity, other prices, income and tastes. Some of the factors have been introduced in the theory of demand recently. We will first examine the traditional static theory of demand and subsequently we will briefly discuss some recent developments in the field. It should be noted that the traditional theory of demand examines only the final consumer's demand for durables and non-durables. It is partial in its approach in that it examines the demand in one market in isolation from the conditions of demand in other markets. An important implicit assumption of the theory of demand is that firms sell their products directly to the final consumers. This is not the general case in the modern business world, and this has serious implications for the determination of prices. Another shortcoming of the traditional theory is that it does not deal with the demand for investment goods nor with the demand for intermediate products. Total demand includes final demand and intermediate demand. Final demand is subdivided into consumer demand and demand for investment goods. Traditional theory of demand deals only with consumer demand, which is only a fraction of the total demand in the economy as a whole. In this section, we examine the traditional theory of consumer demand. In section 4, we look at the demand of the individual firm. And we discuss the various sources of demand for the product of manufacturing firms in particular. The analysis will cover some aspects of the demand for intermediate commodities and for investment goods. Theory of consumer behavior. The traditional theory of demand starts with the examination of the behavior of the consumer. Since the market demand is assumed to be the summation of demands, consumer demand ranges between 30 and 40% of total demand in developed economies. Individual consumers. Thus, we will first examine the derivation of demand for an individual consumer. The consumer is assumed to be rational. Given his income and the market prices of the various commodities, he plans the spending of his income so as to attain the highest possible satisfaction or utility. This is the axiom of utility maximization. In the traditional theory, it is assumed that the consumer has full knowledge of all the information relevant to his decision. That is, he has complete knowledge of all the available commodities, their price and his income. In order to attain this objective, the consumer must be able to compare the utility in bracket satisfaction of the various basket of goods which he can buy with his income. There are two basic approaches to the problem of comparison of utilities: the cardinalist approach and the ordinalist approach. The cardinalist school postulated that utility can be measured. Various suggestions have been made for the measurement of utility. Under certainty, complete knowledge of market conditions and income levels over the planning period, some economists have suggested that utility can be measured in monetary units, by the amount of money the consumer is willing to sacrifice for another unit of commodity. Others suggested the measurement of utility in subjective units called utils. The ordinal school postulated that utility is not measurable but is an ordinal magnitude. The consumer need to not know in specific units the utility of various commodities to make his choice. It suffices for him to be able to rank the various baskets of goods according to the satisfaction that each bundle gives him. He must be able to determine his order of preference among the different bundle of goods. The main ordinal theories are the indifference curve approach and the revealed preference hypothesis. In examining the above approaches, we will first state that assumptions underlying each approach derive the equilibrium of the consumer, and from this determine his demand for the individual products. Finally, we point out the weakness of each approach. A. The Cardinal Utility Theory assumptions. Number 1 is rationality. The consumer is rational. He aims at the maximization of his utility subject to the constraint imposed by his given income. Number 2 is cardinal utility. The utility of each commodity is measurable. Utility is cardinal concept. The most convenient measure is money. The utility is measured by the monetary units that the consumer is prepared to pay for another unit of the commodity. Number 3 is constant marginal utility of money. The assumption is necessary if the monetary unit is used as the measure of utility. The essential feature of a standard unit of measurement is that it be constant. If the marginal utility of money changes as income increases or decreases, the measuring rod for utility becomes like an elastic ruler, inappropriate for measurement. Number 4 is diminishing marginal utility. The utility gained from successive units of commodity diminishes. In other words, the marginal utility of a commodity diminishes as the consumer acquires larger quantities of it. This is the axiom of diminishing marginal utility. The concept of subjective measurable utility is attributed to Gosson 1854, Jevons 1871 and Walras 1874. Marshall 1890 also assumed independent and additive utilities, but his position on utility is not clear in several aspects. Number 5 is the total utility of a basket of goods depends on the quantities of the individual commodities. If there are n commodities in the bundle with quantities x1, x2 xn, the total utility is capital U is equal to function of x1, x2, xn. In very early versions of the theory of consumer behavior, it was assumed that the total utility is additive. Capital U is equal to capital U1 bracket x1 plus U2 bracket x2 plus UN bracket xn. The additivity assumption was dropped in later versions of the Cardinal Utility Theory. Additivity implies independent utilities of the various commodities in the bundle, an assumption clearly unrealistic and unnecessary for the Cardinal Utility Theory. Derivation of the demand of the consumer. The derivation of demand based on the axiom of diminishing marginal utility. The marginal utility of commodity X may be depicted by a line with a negative slope. Mathematically, the marginal utility of X is the slope of the total utility function U is equal to F of Qx, the total utility increases but at a decreasing rate up to quantity x and then starts declining. Accordingly, the marginal utility of x declines continuously and becomes negative beyond quantity x. If the marginal utility is measured in monetary units, the demand curve for x is identical to the positive segment of the marginal utility curve. At x1, the marginal utility is M, capital M U1. This is equal to P1 by definition. Hence, at P1, the consumer demands x1 quantity. Similarly, at x2, the marginal utility is capital M, capital U2, which is equal to P2. Hence, capital P2 is the consumer will buy x2 and so on. The negative section of the MU curve does not form part of the demand curve since negative quantities do not make any sense in economics. Critique of the cardinal approach. There are three basic weaknesses in the cardinalist approach. The assumption of cardinal utility is extremely doubtful. The satisfaction derived from various commodities cannot be measured objectively. The attempt by Walras to use subjective units used for the measurement of utility does not provide any satisfactory solution. The assumption of constant utility of money is also unrealistic. As income increases, the marginal utility of money changes. Thus, money cannot be used as a measuring rod since its own utility changes. Finally, the axiom of diminishing marginal utility has been established from introspection. It is a psychological law which must be taken for granted. B. The indifference curve theory. Assumptions. Number 1 is rationality. The consumer is assumed to be rational. He aims at the maximization of his utility given his income and market prices. It is assumed he has full knowledge, certainty of all relevant information. Number 2 is utility is ordinal. It is taken as axiomatically true that the consumer can rank his preference, order the various baskets of goods according to the satisfaction of each basket. He need not know precisely the amount of satisfaction. It suffices that he expresses his preference for the various bundles of commodities. It is not necessary to assume that the utility is cardinally measurable. Only ordinal measurement is required. Number 3 is diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Preferences are ranked in terms of indifference curves which are assumed to be convex to the origin. This implies that the slope of the indifference curve increases. The slope of the indifference curve is called the marginal rate of substitution of the commodities. The indifference curve theory is based thus on the axiom of diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Number 4 is the total utility of the consumer depends on the quantities of commodities consumed. Capital U is equal to function of Q1, Q2, dash Qx, Qy, dash Qn. Bracket close. Number 5 is consistency and transitivity of choice. It is assumed that the consumer is consistent in his choice, that is, if in one period he chooses bundle A over B, he will not choose B over A in another period if both bundles are available to him. This consistency assumption may be symbolically written as follows: if capital A is greater than capital B, then capital B is not greater than capital A. Similarly, it is assumed that consumer choices are characterized by transitivity. If bundle A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, then bundle A is preferred to capital C. Symbolically, we may write the transitivity assumption as follows: if capital A is greater than capital B and capital B is greater than capital C, then capital A is greater than capital C. Derivation of the demand curve using the indifference curve approach. Graphical derivation of the demand curve. As the prices of a commodity, for example X, falls, the budget line of the consumer shifts to the right from its initial position AB to a new position AB prime. Due to the increase in its purchasing power of the given money income of the consumer, with more purchasing power in his possession, the consumer can buy more of X and more of Y. The new budget line is tangent to a higher indifference curve. The new equilibrium occurs to the right of the original equilibrium for normal goods, showing that as price falls, more of the commodity will be bought. If we allow the prices of X to fall continuously and we join the points of tangency of successive budget lines and the higher indifference curves, we form the so-called price consumption line, from which we derive the demand curve for commodity X. At point E1, the consumer buys quantity X1 at price Y1. At point E2, the price Y2 is lower than Y1 and the quantity demanded has increased to X2, and so on. We may plot the price quantity pairs defined by the points of equilibrium bracket on the price consumption line to obtain a demand curve. The demand curve for normal commodities will always have a negative slope, denoting the law of demand. The quantity bought increases as the price falls. In the indifference curve approach, the law of demand is derived from what is known as Slutsky's theorem, which states that the substitution effect of a price change is always negative. The formal proof of Slutsky's theorem involves sophisticated mathematics. However, we may show graphically the implications of this theorem. A commodity is defined as normal when its demand changes in the same direction as income. If the demand of a commodity decreases when income increases, the commodity is called inferior. We saw that a fall in the price of X from P1 to P2 resulted in an increase in the quantity demanded from X1 to X2. This is the total price effect, which may be split into two separate effects, a substitution effect and an income effect. The substitution effect is the increase in the quantity bought as the price of the commodity falls after adjusting income so as to keep the real purchasing power of the consumer the same as before. This adjustment in income is called compensating variation and is shown graphically by a parallel shift of the new budget line until it becomes tangent to the initial indifference curve. The purpose of the compensating variation is to allow the consumer to remain on the same level of satisfaction as before the price change. The compensated budget line will be tangent to the original demand curve at point E1 prime, to the right of the original tangency E1, because this line is parallel to the new budget line, which is less steep than the original one when the price of X falls. The movement from point E1 to E1 prime shows the substitution effect of a price change. The consumer buys more of X now that it is cheaper, substituting Y for X. However, the compensating variation is a device which enables the isolation of the substitution effect but does not show the new equilibrium of the consumer. This is defined by point E2 on the higher indifference curve. 2. The consumer has in fact a higher purchasing power, and if the commodity is normal, he will spend some of his increased real income on X, and thus moving from X1 prime to X2. This is the income effect of the price change. The income effect of a price change is negative for normal goods, and it reinforces the negative substitution effect. If, however, the commodity is inferior, the income effect will be positive. As the purchasing power increases, less of X will be bought. Still, for most of the inferior goods, the negative substitution effect will be more than offset the positive income effect, so that the total price effect will be negative. Thus, the negative substitution effect is the most cases adequate for establishing the law of demand. It is when the income effect is positive and very strong that the law of demand does not hold. This is the case of the given goods, which are inferior and their demand curve has a positive slope. Given goods are very rare in practice. It should be noted that although Slutsky's theorem can be proved mathematically, its proof is based on the axiomatic assumption of the convexity of the indifference curve.